Hello. So in this video, I'd like to show you how to deseasonalize some seasonal demand, but this time instead of using indices and dividing by an index in order to remove seasonality, what we're going to do instead is subtract out the composite. So if you have seasonal data, let's take a look at it. Here I have an example of some seasonal data. And if we take a look at it just to check and make sure it is seasonal, so I'm going to select those two columns and let's take a quick look at the chart here. Okay, so yeah, so there it is. And you can see that it's high here in December. Here it's kind of high. Well, that's actually not as high as over there. But then it kind of drops off in January. That's kind of a peak right here, peak right here, peak right here. So it does look sort of similar. There's a few little differences, and it jumps up here again, and this would be December. So this is a product or a time series that has kind of increased demand toward the end of the year, November and December. This is looks like it's November and December. And then it falls off the rest of the year. So that's definitely seasonality, and I have 3 years there. So I'm going to put that down. And what I want to do is I want to build a composite, which is an average of these 3 historical years. And then I'm going to use this composite to come up with a seasonal component. But this time, instead of removing the seasonality out of our demand by dividing by an index, instead we'll just use this composite straight and subtract it from the demand, and then we'll get a residual after we subtract. And this will be pretty similar to the way we used the deseasonalized demand when we used the indices. So you'll see what we're doing when we finally get the calculation going here. But to start with, I'm going to take this composite, which I've already computed, and these composites, if you remember, are just the average over the like months. So this composite over here is the average of all Januaries. This composite is the average of all Februaries. This composite is the average over all Marches. This is the average over all Aprils, and so on. So I want to take this and transfer it down so we have it for the whole 3 years here. So I'm just going to make a copy of this and come down here and use paste special values. And the reason I need that is because there's formulas in there right now. And I just want the values to be copied and pasted down. Then I'm going to go down here and say paste special values only again so that we get all 3 years for the composite. So here I have the original demand, which has the seasonality in it, and here I have the average composite behavior. So these are the averages for each month, and what we're going to do is actually take these and subtract them. Okay, so this is the component, this is the composite over here, and this is going to be the seasonal component here. So in fact, I'm just going to say equal, and then I'm going to come over here and grab that composite and put it in there. So this is called the seasonal component. It's just the same averages over and over each year. Okay, so if we looked at a picture of this, we'll see the demand as one series and the seasonal component as another. So let's actually go ahead and do that. If you select all 3 like this, whoops, that's too much. You select all 3 like this, and you say insert chart like that. Yeah, you'll see. So here in red is the seasonal component, and that's the average over all of them. You can see the seasonal component looks the same each time. It looks exactly the same because we copied and pasted the same 12 values for each year there. So the red graph here is the averages over all of the historical demand. So the actual demand is here, and you can see the actual demand kind of fluctuates a little bit above and a little bit below that seasonal component. And what we're going to do to deseasonalize this time, instead of dividing by an index, what we're going to do is subtract. So you can also deseasonalize by subtracting out the seasonal component or the data that represents the seasonality, and come up with this thing called the residual. And the residual will be the thing that's sort of like the before for the deseasonalized demand that'll tell us whether or not a month is above average or below average in terms of demand. So here's what we'll do. We'll just subtract here. We're going to say the demand minus the seasonal component. And so that's negative, but that just means that that the seasonal component is greater than the demand. And so when you subtract that, residual is going to be negative. So I'm going to drag this down and get it for all three like that. Good. Okay. So I have the demand, I have the seasonal component, and then I have the residual. So I want to take a look at this graph now. So let's select these three. Yeah, let's select all three of those and come down here and say insert chart, and I want to explain to you how this residual works. So that doesn't look right. How about something like that? So I think maybe we need use column. Yeah, that looks better. Okay, so I clicked on use column B as labels, and I'm going to go and get the lollipops so we can talk about them. Lollipops, let's make them 7 like that. Good. And I'm going to put those down. I'm also going to increase the size of this a little bit and see if I can make these guys down here. I want to change the slant of those to be like that. And how many years do I have? 3. So I have 3 years, so I'm going to go down to grid lines and say 36 for those, so I get all the labels, so we get them all. Okay, and now I want to talk about the meaning of this residual. So what I did was we took the actual demand, which is in blue, and we took the average seasonal component. So the seasonal component is how we do on average every year, and it's the same. It should look exactly the same. So here's the first 12 months, and there's the seasonal component, and then it exactly repeats. Here's the seasonal component again, and here's the seasonal component again. And in comparison to that, the actual demand is sometimes above that seasonal component. So we have kind of an exceptional month would be ones where we're above the average, and a bad month would be ones where we're kind of below that average, right? So here's some actual demand over here where we're below the seasonal component, so that's below average behavior for us. So anywhere where the blue graph is above the red, that's good news. Anywhere where the blue graph falls below the red graph, that's bad news for us. And you can see that in the residual down here when you subtract these two. So this down here is called the residual, and it's what's left over after you take the seasonality out of your data. And in this case, taking the seasonality out means subtracting, not dividing by an index like we were doing before. So this graph down here is kind of like that deseasonal graph that we looked at last time when we were removing the seasonality by deseasonalizing with the indices. Although here we're not using any indices, we just subtract out in order to remove this component. And it's pretty easy to identify good months and bad months now. Months where demand was higher than normal are months where this residual graph is above the 0 here, so above the horizontal axis. And ones where it's below is where it's negative. Those are months that are weaker than average. So weaker than average occurs when the graph, this residual graph, is below the horizontal axis, and better than average behavior, better than average months occur where that graph is above this horizontal axis. So it's pretty easy to identify by looking at the residual when you had months that were good and when you had months that were bad. So this is yet another way to deseasonalize the data. And when you deseasonalize data, what you're interested in really is being able to look at a graph that easily tells you where your above average months are and where your below average months are. And if you see any kind of period that's kind of consistently, periods that are consistently above or below, you might worry what's causing that kind of fall off from your typical demand. You're not really getting the demand that you normally get. So you might wonder what is going on in a situation like that, where it's sort of repeatedly above on one side of this graph like that.